Public Library. I'm Katie Stover, the Director of Reader Services, and we are very glad that you're here with us tonight about an event in Kansas City's history that many of you probably still remember as if it happened yesterday. I know I do, and I didn't even live here at the time. I was living in New York. On July 17, 1981, 2 of the 3 Skywalks in Kansas City's Hyatt Regency Hotel collapsed, killing 114 people and hurting more than 200. And I imagine a great many of you here in the audience know someone who was there that night and have your own stories to share about that evening. Right away, though, journalists and lawyers started interviewing victims and witnesses, trying to figure out what had happened and who was to blame. It was mind-boggling that a beautiful new building like the Hyatt could have fallen apart so spectacularly. One of the attorneys, Robert Gordon, not among the so-called ambulance chasers, served as co-lead counsel on behalf of the plaintiffs in what were called the federal Skywalk cases. Gordon doggedly uncovered clearly damning evidence that he thought would secure a massive judgment in his client's favor and severe punishment for those at fault. But that is not what happened. The case was settled out of court in 1983, and Gordon never presented his findings, which laid much of the blame at the feet of one of Kansas City's most beloved corporations, Hallmark. Gordon spent the rest of his life trying to tell that story, but he died in 2008 without managing to. And then about 8 years ago, Gordon's son, Andy, made a call to the Kansas City Public Library. He wanted to know if the library would be interested in his father's papers. Well, look at this library. We'll collect almost anything. Eli Paul, then head of the library's Missouri Valley Special Collections, accepted 180 boxes of documents about the disaster. 180. If anyone's ever cleaned out an office and you've seen those boxes, imagine 180 of those. But before his retirement in 2016, Eli had built a 40-year career as one of the region's most accomplished historians. 5 of those years were spent right here on the 5th floor. And so that makes him a perfect person to tell this singular Kansas City story. Eli is a natural-born storyteller. It was so easy to pass an afternoon in the Missouri Valley room just listening to him talk and tell story after story about Kansas City. He is the history professor you wish you had, and we are unspeakably lucky to have had Eli build part of our special collections here at Kansas City Public Library. Please welcome our dear friend and esteemed colleague, Eli Paul.
Eli Paul, I want to meet that guy. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I know this isn't the happiest topic, but it is appropriate that this book launch is here at the library. As you heard, the Robert Gordon papers are part of the great collections here, the Missouri Valley Special Collections, and it's just appropriate that we tell this story tonight for the first time. And with that, I think we'll jump into it. In early 1981, the local Hyatt management came up with an idea modeled on one of Hyatt's in other cities. They had a way for the curious public to share in the glamour of their new hotel, as well as enhancing regular foot traffic through the doors. Every Friday evening, tea time in a bygone age, the hotel would hold a tea dance in the spacious lobby, and in typical Midwestern fashion, the dance floor would be open to all. Big bands would play dance music for couples of all ages to foxtrot, jitterbug, rumba, and waltz, some competitively. The skywalks that spanned the lobby offered unique vantage points to see and be seen. From the first dance in May, the weekly spectacle caught on immediately in Kansas City. As many as 2,000 dancers, musicians, partygoers, wait staff, and onlookers jammed the atrium lobby and the adjacent bars and restaurants for hours of high-spirited fun. On a hot summer's evening of Friday, July 17th, 1981, the revelry ended with the worst structural failure in the nation's history and arguably the worst thing that ever happened to Kansas City. The last thing Maxine Rhodes remembered was hearing a rumble like a California earthquake. To Kay Kenton, it was a really loud noise like railroad cars crashing. Shirley Stover remembered plunging through the air, certain she was going to die, a scream of terror frozen in her throat. She saw the orange tiles of the dance floor rushing toward her face. She landed on her head and shoulders. Something landed on her. Then it was dark. Elvin Gubar, waiting in the part of the lobby bar called the Pit, saw the bottom of the lower skywalk split apart and drop toward her husband, Joe. She watched Joe lift his arms and disappear under an avalanche of debris. Evelyn bravely started to run toward her husband, but a wall of wind knocked her headfirst back into the pit. In the same way that a book slammed onto a desk will send nearby papers flying, a powerful salvo of wind and debris shot out in every direction, demolishing tables and chairs, knocking people together, blowing musicians off the bandstand. Molly Riley, who was standing on the dance floor less than 10 feet from the line of impact, was hit by flying glass and pieces of concrete. Molly's first thought was that there was a fight and someone had dropped a tray of glasses. She was knocked backward by the maelstrom, but managed to stay on her feet. She had to keep her eyes closed against the wind and a rain of glass fragments. She thought of her 2-year-old son and hoped that she would be able to hold him just once more. After she could see, Molly found herself near the bandstand and in front of the KMBC cameraman, Dave Forstate, who was facing westward as though paralyzed. She turned to see why he was transfixed and faced a picture of unbelievable devastation. A jumble of wreckage stretched away to her right. There was someone in the rubble wearing blue. Was it her friend Gay? Gay was wearing blue. People next to Molly stood like ghosts, white with the dust of concrete and plaster. "Run," someone shouted. "Get out, it's all going to come down." "I can't run," Molly Riley thought. "I'm a nurse." She braced herself and walked toward the victims. 2 suspended walkways, or skywalks, in Kansas City's newest and most exciting hotel had pulled loose from their roof supports. More than 60 tons of steel, concrete, and glass crashed on hundreds of partiers below. There was no warning and no chance of escape. Of the more than 1,500 persons present in the hotel lobby where the disaster occurred, 114 died from their injuries. Most did so immediately. More than 200 were injured, some trapped for hours. First responders struggled amidst the twisted rubble and chaotic conditions, in some instances resorting to emergency amputations to free victims. About 1,000 emergency personnel and volunteer rescuers arrived on the scene, as did the city's mayor, who could be seen carrying a stretcher to move the wounded to care. The city's hospitals received the alarm to prepare for a flood of patients. Journalists rushed in and captured the hellish scene with words, photographs, and videotape, the most gruesome of which were never shared with the public. As word spread across the Kansas City metro area, and in a time before cell phones and 24-hour cable news, family members anxiously sought information of any kind about loved ones at risk. All were witnessing the result of a man-made disaster of epic proportions, one that immediately became a national story, and the question immediately arose: what caused the skywalks to fall? A hastily assembled team of investigative reporters from the jointly owned Kansas City Times and Kansas City Star soon came up with an initial answer to the mystery of the disaster. The suspended walkway connections, a system of vertical hanger rods of thin diameter steel attached to the Skywalks, had failed. A field examination by the press's own technical consultant quickly exposed the problem. Federal government analysts later confirmed through simple engineering computations that the system had no chance of supporting the weight that the heavy structures were expected to carry, loaded with people or not. Now the question's narrowed. Who was to blame for this building failure? Who was liable financially and maybe criminally for the many deaths and injuries? The sad stories of the eyewitnesses became the ultimate narrative of the event. So much so that when memorialized 30 years later with the Kansas City Star book entitled The Last Dance, the dramatic testimony of the victims, survivors, their families, and the rescuers took center stage, as it deserved. Within the book's pages was a chapter on the extensive reporting that had led to the awarding of a Pulitzer Prize to the local newsrooms. Later, the press uncovered the systemic and shameful lack of enforcement of the city's building codes. Cleaning house at City Hall and toughening inspections were among the few positive outcomes in the whole affair. Also mentioned prominently in the 2011 book was the role of two structural engineers who had worked on the project. Later, they were held professionally, but not criminally, responsible for the faulty Skywalks design and subsequently lost their licenses to practice their profession in the state. The authors, though, said little about the many months of courtroom battles that began almost immediately after the collapse and largely ended in 1983. The insurers of the defendants paid out about $150 million to settle the case and compensate the victims. Of that figure, only a fraction was considered as punitive damages, the type meant to punish defendants, make a bold statement about the gravity of their offense, and prevent its reoccurrence. The legal community that followed closely these contentious proceedings reached a consensus. If the case had gone to trial, the dollar figures would have been several times higher. In other words, the defendants had gotten off relatively easy, with the insurers bearing the brunt. In general, the cause of the disaster was confined to a specific structural failure and the blame to two specific professionals. For the most part, this drew the so-called Hyatt Skywalks disaster to a close for a city whose citizens had grown weary of reliving the painful night, much less enduring the courtroom antics, public accusations, private rumors, and bad national press. Kansas Cityans, on the whole, were ready to let go and move on. One person, though, refused to let go. This is a picture of Robert Gordon, who's the main character in my book. You might recognize the gentleman on the left. That's Mayor Richard Berkeley at the time. I don't know who the woman is. If anyone knows, please tell me later. I think Mr. Gordon is wearing one of his usual seersucker suits as well. This is often mentioned in the newspapers about him and his seersucker suits. Mostly tonight I'm going to talk about why he wrote his book. First, I probably should tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book. And you got some of it from Katie in the introduction, and that was, it basically started with a phone call from Andy Gordon, Robert Gordon's son, who was looking for a home for those papers. And when he called, I must admit, when he said that he had the papers of Robert Gordon, a lawyer, it didn't ring any bells with me. But when he said he worked on the Hyatt case, that did. We at the library went and investigated the collection. Actually tonight, 3 of the archivists who helped box up those 180 boxes are here, and that was quite an experience to do that. But as we were looking through all that massive material that was in Andy Gordon's garage, he had teased me with the notion that there was a book. His father had written a book, and it was in that massive material, and we all kept our eyes open for it. And at one point, there was a eureka moment. We found what turned out to be one half of one of his early versions. It was only later, once the materials was brought back and one of the archivists went through, that we actually found what I feel was his final version of his book. But of course, before taking that large collection, I did have to receive the approval of the then library director, Crosby Kemper. And I said, you know, this is going to be rather controversial. This guy has some really pointed accusations in his papers, and it, you know, it might step on somebody's toes, and it might, you know, touch on one of the first families of Kansas City. Of course, I'm talking to one of the members of the first families of Kansas City, so he did not see that as an issue. What Crosby wanted to make sure that I did was to tread lightly, but also to keep the survivors in mind. That was topmost on his agenda. You know, let's do something. Whatever we do with this collection, we don't want to upset the people who have already lived through traumatic times. I became interested in this story, although if you know my work, and very few of you do, but if you knew my work, it's primarily in the 19th century, dealing with the American West, the Frontier Army, Plains Indian Wars. What can I bring to this story and to this project? Well, I have did a book on another national disaster. That was the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. I worked on another book, which was yet another Untold failed book project, which was a book about the autobiography of Chief Red Cloud, which had lain dormant for several decades. I also had, at one point in my life, been the museum director of the National World War I Museum when, in the year 2006, we opened up that great new museum here in Kansas City. So I had a little perspective on the problems of project management for big construction projects. So for a historian of the 19th century, I could bring a lot of things to bear on a very 20th century story. The turning point for me to actually start a book came in 2018. By that time, I was retired, but I'd done research on the topic, and what I had found was, you know, a very one-sided view in terms of Bob Gordon and his personality, a very prickly person, as described by others, very obsessed with his work. But in 2018, I had an opportunity to talk with his son, Andy, and his ex-wife, Josie, about Bob Gordon the man, and they really helped me flesh out this individual, that he wasn't a cartoon character as portrayed by so many of his adversaries, but really a well-rounded, even called brilliant individual who brought a great deal of passion to this topic. So at that point, I had a full character, I thought, who could really help tell this story through one person's perspective. The format of my book is really two big halves. The first half is, why did Gordon write this book? And I have to answer that by giving you the entire context of the Skywalks disaster, as well as the great legal battles that followed that. The second half of my book is, why wasn't it published? I think I tried to give you all the context that you need to, in some ways, reach your own conclusions on that. My talk tonight really focuses on the first question: why did Gordon become an author? And with that, I'm going to return to my story. On Monday morning, January 10th, 1983, Gordon showed up to a packed federal courthouse for the first day of trial, documents and exhibits in tow. For the past year, Gordon had almost single-handedly poured through more than 1 million pages of documents relating to the federal Skywalks cases, deposed dozens of witnesses, and prepared a stack of lengthy briefs during the ensuing months of litigation. This lawyer's command of the facts in the case led him to formulate a thesis which Irving Younger, the lead counsel for the plaintiffs, had embraced. Younger was a partner in Williams & Connolly, a powerhouse law firm of Washington, D.C., and a nationally known attorney and scholar. He famously came up with the lawyer's 10 rules of cross-examination, one of which you all know. Don't ask a question unless you already know an answer. He was a spellbinding speaker, especially in the courtroom. Younger had not returned Gordon's calls over the weekend, was in chambers with Judge Scott Wright, along with lawyers from the other side. The adversaries had met privately over the weekend to hash out a settlement, which Gordon vehemently opposed. When the judge entered the court, he proclaimed that there would be no trial. Judge Wright, whose later memoir was entitled Never in Doubt, nonetheless had quote-unquote mixed feelings about how the case ended, but the contest was officially over. An enterprising reporter got the immediate reactions of 5 victims to the settlement, one of whom was Molly Riley. Unlike the others, she was not ready to put the tragedy behind her. The public really needed to know what happened, and I don't think it will ever come out. Gordon retreated from the courthouse to his office and immediately began the dismal process of boxing up his precious documents and putting his office back in order. For once, no one from the paper called to disturb his work. 3 days later, he moved his case files to off-site storage. The defeated lawyer then made a life-changing decision. He abruptly switched gears, abandoned his law practice for the moment, and ventured forth in an alien field. Bob Gordon would become an author, although little in his background hinted at the talents needed by a writer of mass-market nonfiction. His access to the sheer volume of evidence, his widely acknowledged command of the facts, and his public image as an inner-circle player and a lone wolf beholden to nobody made him on the surface an ideal authoritative chronicler. As he proudly told someone he meant to impress, "I no longer need to rely on legal cases for a living. I have no fear of reprisal, as do most practicing attorneys." His means for righting the wrongs he perceived would be a book that told the unvarnished Skywalks story. Specifically, and still controversial to this day, he believed he could lay the real blame on Hallmark Cards. The prestigious name on the hotel carried that of Hyatt, but the Chicago Corporation had no real role in its design or construction. The company merely operated the completed facility as a tenant. The keys to the new building had been turned over to Hyatt managers by the owner at a gala opening in July of 1980. Donald J. Hall Sr., Don Hall, enjoyed the honor as president of the privately held, family-owned Hallmark Cards, Inc. Only 8 years previous, his father and company founder, Joyce Hall, had gone through a similar ceremony when the Westin Crown Center Hotel had opened nearby, on time and on budget, as he always reminded his son. A segment of its business portfolio lesser known nationally than for its greeting cards, retail outlets, and prestigious television movies, Hallmark was a major Kansas City developer, and its new convention hotel near corporate headquarters was its latest, grandest statement. Was the city's largest private employer, whose reputation and brand meant that of the highest quality, and whose slogan was, "When you care enough to send the very best," in some way responsible for this carnage. Who was this man, Robert Gordon, to level a charge of gross negligence against an iconic corporation, a good corporate citizen? A native Kansas Citian born in 1940, Robert Charles Bobby Gordon was a 1959 alumnus of Southwest High School. A smart student, Gordon left to attend the University of California at Berkeley, where he earned an honors degree in political science and another from the university's prestigious School of Law. After graduating in 1966, his father, M.C. Gordon, wanted him to go into the family's clothing manufacturing business, the Burlington Overall Company, located in the heart of Kansas City's garment district, just a few blocks away. Gordon wanted no part of his family's business, although his going to law school was originally intended to bring needed legal skills to the company. He did return to Kansas City, though, and forged a career in the law, first serving as a clerk to William Henry Becker, chief judge of the U.S. District Court here, and then joining one of the city's prestigious firms, eventually ending up in his own law office on the Country Club Plaza. His legal specialty became corporate fraud and antitrust, areas in which class action lawsuits were common. In 1969, the young attorney married Josie Picard, a Vassar graduate whose Kansas City family was one of wealth and standing. 2 children followed, and the Gordon family eventually resided in a spacious English Tudor mansion in Mission Hills, Kansas, then and now an exclusive enclave of suburban Kansas City. One can only conclude from his standing within the profession and the community that Robert Gordon was a member of Kansas City's elite, particularly at the time of the 1981 disaster. That background did not tamp down Gordon's crusader spirit. In 1968, violent riots racked Kansas City in the aftermath of the Martin Luther King assassination. To quell the civil unrest, the police ham-handedly carried out wholesale roundups of East Side residents, rioters or not. Gordon viewed this with disgust and jumped in to do pro bono legal work on behalf of wrongfully arrested members of the African American community. To him, it was simply the right thing to do, although his peers may have viewed his actions as merely the attributes of a naive Don Quixote. As Gordon butted heads with adversaries in the federal Skywalks cases, the descriptors became even less flattering. Dogged, wrote one admiring journalist, a trait one desires in their lawyer, as is combative, a word his son used. As if following a musical scale from a lower to higher register, the words also included insecure, offensive, reckless, and irrational. One lawyer called him an acquired taste. Many came up with the same word for Gordon during his quest for the truth behind the worst American building collapse until the fall of New York's Twin Towers: obsessed. Gordon once told a correspondent, "I have at times been quite outspoken about my colleagues, and I consider their antipathy sufficient reward." Little wonder that this iconoclast never ran out of people, beliefs, or institutions to confront, and vice versa, a situation that helped neither his legal or subsequent writing career. One personality trait on which all could agree was Gordon's work ethic, one that appeared more like the famous biographer Robert Caro, known for his edict to researchers to turn every page. Gordon once proudly stated, "For sheer intellectual pleasure, I've never known anything to compare with the excitement and challenge of using a defendant's own documents to prove the plaintiff's case. In my experience, the success of any case against a major corporation always depended on the documents." More importantly, Gordon became the unassailable expert on the minutiae of the Skywalks case, an incredible source for others, and seemingly its natural chronicler. Maybe because of his odd mix of personal history, singular strengths, and character quirks, he felt compelled to speak truth to power. This privileged insider was in a unique position to formulate and champion a novel, even contrarian view of what caused a modern building to fall and crush the life of 114 people. Gordon's considerable personal wealth provided a certain level of independence from the pressures exerted by a restrictive legal community and granted him the liberty to stir the pot, a freedom few others shared, much less sought. He was a volatile messenger to carry such an explosive message. Robert Gordon developed a carefully assembled explanation of why the Skywalks at Hallmark's new hotel inevitably fell. And it began with an incident that he believed should have stopped the construction project cold in its tracks. Okay, I have a question for the audience. How many of you knew or know that before the Skywalks collapsed in 1981, that the Hyatt's roof collapsed in 1979? That's actually more than I thought. On October 14th, 1979, in the midst of construction and 2 years before the 1981 catastrophe, the lobby's atrium roof collapsed and dropped tons of debris on the lobby floor below. A 118-foot-long heavy steel beam of support had pulled from its wall connections and carried down 2,700 square feet of recently poured concrete roof. The mass fell from a height of 4 stories, barely missing the newly installed Skywalks. I think up here, that's a Robert Gordon Post-it note there, and it says, Hallmark called this a minor problem. That is looking down from the roof. Luckily, no workers were present at the after-hours crash. This was an unmistakable warning that all was not right in the new hotel. The single most important prior event in this case, believed Gordon. How the owner responded to this reddest of red flags provided the tentpole for the quote-unquote Gordon thesis, as it was derisively called by its critics. According to the documentary evidence that Gordon amassed to bolster his argument, he believed that Hallmark, the hotel owner, did not heed this warning.
Could you go back and read that note?
I will. Actually, the note reads, Hallmark said was a 16-foot beam failure. Before the accident, the project had strictly adhered to a design-build plan, one intended to save time and money by eliminating a slew of potential bidders who would have painstakingly pored over a set of completed building plans to price and schedule the job. Design-build avoided this time-consuming bidding step in part by preparing detailed architectural, structural, and mechanical documents for the contractor in an almost just-in-time approach. By definition, the design and construction phases overlapped. The inevitable glitch that might appear early on a blueprint detail often revealed itself distressingly late, caught only after the thing was actually built and installed. The cost to stop and correct could be exponential. Other stressors came into play as the project managers saw their timetable and budget seriously threatened by any work stoppage. During the month of the atrium roof collapse, Hallmark reported it had already booked 400,000 future room reservations. These receipts were needed as soon as possible to pay off multi-million-dollar building loans taken out in a day when interest rates had reached double figures nationwide. This provided the motivation, Gordon believed, for corner cutting. Keith Kelly, the Hallmark executive in charge of the project's day-to-day management, understood what the atrium roof collapse would do to the already tight time schedule. Kelly's solution to the timetable problem was simple. To survive, observed Gordon, he had to keep the project moving at its incredible rapid pace, doubling down on the fast-track approach. Kelly called for an October 19th emergency meeting of the principals, including architect Bob Berkebile of the PBNDML firm, contractor Carl Eldridge of Eldridge Construction, engineer Jack Gillum of the Gillum-Calaco firm, and Lawrence Poisner, head of general testing, where they heard Hallmark's hard line on the budget. Quote, Crown Center will not accept the cost for any other item of work associated with this failure and structural inadequacies, neither remedial work, reconstruction work, cleanup, nor professional services. Kelly, who would in a couple years get fired by Hallmark, fail upward and head the massive high-profile Union Station renovation in Washington, D.C., received no pushback from his boss, James McClune, president of Crown Center Redevelopment Corporation. McClune, who reported directly to Don Hall, parroted the on-time, on-budget mantra. Those farther from the boardroom, though, expressed their concerns with the shortcomings of fast-tracking. Jerry Cyphers, Hallmark's eyes and ears on the job site, later summed it up best. We never knew from one day to the next what would be worked on. That made it practically impossible to schedule inspections or do any checking for quality. Gordon set the stage, therefore, for jurors and later book readers to accept another tenet in his carefully constructed thesis. Everyone in the room knew that building inspection at the Hyatt Regency was a sham, but no one had a financial incentive to bring problems to light. The post-roof collapse situation in 1979 demanded someone, anyone, to speak up and ask whether other areas of the construction site were at risk and to halt work until a thorough, comprehensive inspection was made. Any detailed site survey, together with an examination of building plans against as-built elements, should have uncovered the faulty engineering, fabrication, and installation of the Skywalks. To a layman today, knowing what happened soon thereafter in 1981, this course of action seems ridiculously obvious. It seems so to Robert Gordon. Yet this action was not done and another course taken instead. In the period October through December 1979, Hallmark corporate lawyers brought all of the interested groups, architect, engineer, contractor, the many subcontractors, and the owner/project manager together for a series of meetings to discuss the financial perils that they all now faced. As a sidelight, some of these meetings, a couple of these meetings were actually taped at the time. And these tapes were turned up by Gordon during the discovery process. They were sent off to Washington, D.C. to be transcribed. They were in terrible shape, terrible audio quality. And they were sent to the same firm that had done the Watergate tapes. That's a whole nother story. The actions by this host of secondary faceless figures after the atrium roof collapse became the crux of the Gordon narrative. He homed in on the hotel construction's poor project management, the connections, both literal and figurative, between the atrium roof and Skywalks collapses, and the warnings that Hallmark's team ignored. However, the company would never accept this premise that a direct relationship existed between the two collapses. If so, it would have meant that the blame for the Hyatt disaster expanded from one of a single instance of faulty engineering to a toxic environment of bad project management. It meant shifting the blame from only a couple of structural engineers to many others, including the owner who set the schedule, wrote the checks, and supervised them all. It was the Hallmark attorneys who ramrodded the post-collapse response. They effectively stonewalled their corporate insurer by keeping that company's investigator at bay and internally assigned the blame and costs to be eaten by the contractor and his subs. The company's public relations director put out a cover story to the local newspaper that softened the hard facts of the roof collapse. In fact, as you saw before, it was described as one small beam had fallen, nobody was hurt, not much damage, nothing to see here, and it's easily they put it back into place. Just to be safe, the company's vice president in charge of risk management found another insurance company to cover any future collapses. Let me repeat that. Second insurer, second collapse. When Gordon learned that, he could never reconcile that action with that of a blameless, unaware defendant. And probably we can't either. What happened next? Work soon resumed, the necessary roof repairs made, the construction schedule barely hiccuped, and that part of the Hyatt story largely drifted away from public consciousness. When in 1983, Gordon could no longer present findings such as these in a court to a jury and to the world, it becomes understandable that the Crusaders switched gears and decided to write a tell-all book. In the post-Watergate traditional print era of the early 1980s, a mass-market book was a logical choice as his instrument. This helps answer the question, why did this lawyer begin a book project? When Gordon set pen to paper in 1983 and 84 to chronicle the Skywalks disaster, his manuscript's working title was When They Didn't Care Enough. One thing I've noticed about this man, he never shied away from poking the bear. He recounted Hallmark's mad dash to keep its hotel project on time and on budget. Interestingly, this amateur effort appeared to me a more powerful narrative than the heavily revised product that followed. One of my goals for my book has been to give his counter-narrative a fair hearing, one unencumbered by his story of endless eye-glazing legal maneuvers and pointed accusations of a cover-up of damaging evidence. We tend to forget what a huge national story the Skywalks collapse was. This novice writer in Kansas City, therefore, seemingly had no problem in early 1985 with landing a high-powered New York agent to broker a book deal. Knox Berger, an influential veteran editor-turned-agent, was the head of a leading New York agency and a first-class curmudgeon. But he possessed a sterling reputation as a skilled reader with an eye for talent. To his everlasting fame, he had the distinction of accepting, editing, and publishing Kurt Vonnegut's first short story. Berger paired Gordon with Robert Byrne, another writing client. Byrne is very interesting. He has an engineering degree and becomes a novelist, and his specialty is writing about disasters. So he'll have a novel called The Dam, and the dam collapses. And he has a book called Skyscraper, and the skyscraper falls down. So he was considered at the time a disaster maven. That was how he was described. All these three all they needed was a convincing book proposal, a virtual snap, and a serviceable manuscript. The powerful trio went into the 1985 partnership expecting to produce a bestseller in a few months. The soon-to-be first-time author clutched, imagine this scene, he clutched an order form. His editor had mailed him the promotional piece, and here at last was tangible proof that his book was soon to be published. Coming in June, the Simon & Schuster marketers announced. How could any bookseller resist their provocative copy? The text led with, "From the company that cares enough to send you the very best." Another punchier title had been settled on, the shorter but still clever House of Cards. And this is years before the Netflix show. The subtitle carried the heavy load of explaining the book's subject and read, "The Truth Behind the Skywalks Collapse and Hallmark's Hyatt Regency Hotel Disaster." It was imperative that the heretofore deferred blame be meted out to the correct corporate entity, Hallmark, and not Hyatt. And the assigner of blame, the determined truth teller, was, according to the information on the form, the sole author. The only name associated with the 304-page hardcover with 8 black and white photos and a list price of $19.95 was that of Robert C. Gordon. Unfortunately, this scene did not occur and the book flyer did not appear in 1985, when the group project was well underway, as you might think, or in 1986, or even in 1987, but in 1991. What the heck happened in between? Well, that's the second question that I address in my book. What happened? Why didn't House of Cards come out? Why can't you find a copy on the shelves of the Kansas City Public Library today? And I'm not going to answer that question tonight. That I leave to you, the readers of my book. I will tease you, though, with the hint that the project fell apart over and over again. A succession of agents, writers, ghostwriters, editors, publishers, all gamely tried to make a go of the book. All the time, Hallmark lawyers keeping an eye on its progress, although Gordon never wavered from the tenets of his thesis. With his death in 2008, his alternative history of the Hallmark hotel disaster remains largely untold, forgotten. I've come to conclude his is a needed corrective to the generally accepted narrative, or at least to restart the debate. However, I will give you another clue about the stumbling blocks the book project faced. Apparently, Gordon possessed an inability to collaborate. He truly was a lone wolf. This is another of the many characters who tried to edit his work. Kansas City's own John Garrity, then a freelance journalist before his Sports Illustrated career took off. 30 years later, after becoming a Gordon work-for-hire ghostwriter and editor, when I interviewed him, along with one of the archivists at the Missouri Valley Room, the wounds remained fresh. Bob Gordon did not like to be edited. One of the many stories John told us was his job was to take Gordon's very wordy text, boil it down, clean it up, edit it, polish it up, perfect. So he'd get like 5 chapters from Gordon, send him back 2. So he kept his own, what he thought was the master of their project. One day he took more work into Gordon's office, and he found the second master of the book project. And in it, Bob Gordon had taken everything and put it back in that John Garrity had edited out. As you can imagine, Garrity was flummoxed, completely lost, he told me. He felt like he was writing in the sand on a beach. The documentary evidence from the Gordon papers reveals an abundance of examples of the lawyer's inflexible rigidity, which I detail in my book. Maybe that's a byproduct of obsession. I got to the point where I wondered if he ever really wanted to get his book published. Finally, the House of Cards project, like its title, folded in 1993 when Simon & Schuster dropped his book contract. The surviving manuscript clocked in at a whopping 854 pages of narrative. This was 350 more than his New York editors wanted. And that didn't include his footnotes. Thousands of footnotes, detailed footnotes. But as my concluding statement, I must say that a good book with a credible argument, sometimes movingly told, lays hidden in the 22 chapters of the surviving manuscript of House of Cards. One example. Do you remember those words of the survivors at the beginning of my talk? The accounts of Maxine Rhodes, Kay Kenton, Shirley Stover, and Molly Riley? Those are Bob Gordon's words, not mine. And his account of when the Skywalks fell is dramatic, passionate, heartrending, and brutal. No punches pulled. I wisely chose not to read more to you. Notwithstanding Bob Gordon's antipathy to his fellow lawyers and to the people who caused the Skywalks to fall, he possessed a deep, persistent empathy for the hundreds of faultless victims and heroic first responders. They vanished from his story because Gordon didn't know how to keep them in his narrative and keep himself out. But with all the personal distractions, disappointments, and troubles that plagued his book project and the later years of his life, he never forgot them. Gordon once reflected on his life. I quit practicing law. I confess I brooded a while, but then I got angry at myself for doing that. But he refused to being himself considered a victim of Hallmark's hotel's disaster, even after the loss of his career, his marriage, and lastly, his health. Compared to the 114 tea dancers who would never again live, laugh, and love, I had nothing to gripe about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eli. That was fantastic.
Before we do any questions, I would like to recognize two people who are present here today, the children of Bob and Josie Gordon, Tracy and Andy, and they are in the audience somewhere over here. Would you stand or wave or something? Without the Gordon papers, there would be no Skywalks book, so I owe a lot to that family. I think we have time for a few questions, maybe. I'll put my glasses on so I can see you.
I realize that I'm adding an element of difficulty with a crowd this size, but we would ask that you please make your way to the microphone if you have a question so that the folks watching at home can hear the question as well as the answer. That is the hallmark of a really good talk.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for putting this out. Are you going to be signing autographs after this?
I will be.
Thank you.
That was easy.
My name is Bob Berkebile, that you referenced in the book a number of times.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate you writing this book and your motivations in writing it, and I appreciate what you've done for our library before undertaking this project. But I feel like I need to share, as you point out in the book, I was in the room for a number of those decisions. And I haven't read the book yet. I bought it here tonight, but I heard you on Steve Kraske, and I read the references directly to me and my participation. And they are, as I told Bob when he kept pursuing me for interviews, and when I asked him about the thesis, I declined. And he asked me repeatedly, and I continued to decline. And the reason is, at least with regard to the things that I was able to read before you began speaking, they're not consistent with the truth. Don Hall was not pressing to make this faster and cheaper, nor was Hallmark. The firm has worked now in 9 countries. We've worked all over the planet. And this is one of the most conservative, caring clients I've ever worked for. And following the first collapse, not only did they not accelerate the work and look for cuts and say, we're not going to pay for this, they and we shut the project down entirely and asked our structural engineer to return. We hired a new structural engineer, independent. We hired a third engineer who was a failure analysis forensics expert. And with no construction underway, they spent 2 weeks following our directive, which Don Hall supported and repeated. And that was to examine every connection, steel to steel and steel to concrete, and give us a report on their integrity, their compliance with safety, and with the contract documents. That's not what Bob is describing in the few things I was able to read tonight. And I will certainly read the rest, but I think it's, Bob was passionate about this for sure, but I think that he was on a path that was at least inconsistent with my experience, and I would argue the experience of the owner and others who invested a lot of their lives in this community facility.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you for that comment. And I know there wasn't a question there, but I'll ask, the question that could be asked is, what do you want to see come out of this book? That's one of the things I want to see come out of this book is challenges. Enough. You've had your say.
Fair enough. I appreciate that. I did come with a question, and I wanted to be clear about who I was and why I was asking it. The question is, did you do your own independent research after you read all the documents and Bob's draft of the book? Did you do your own research before you prepared this?
I did the research as a historian does a research, and that is with the primary documents in which all these issues were raised. Let me tell you what, one of the things, the purpose of this book, that's a legitimate question of why did I write this book? What do you want to see come out of this book? And that is to have discussions such as this. I would, as a historian, say, Mr. Berkebile, you should write a book about your experiences with the Hyatt. That would be very valuable to the historical community. There was great challenges to Bob Gordon's narrative at the time, as there will be today, and that's a good thing. History needs this. We haven't talked about this subject probably enough. I would say I'm the first historian who really has addressed this topic. Other people have been journalists and engineers and things, people like that. So that's good points that you make. But what I was trying to do here was present a counter narrative that had been not published in a timely manner. It had not appeared. So I felt like that part of the story, that side, that perspective needed to be presented. So thank you. Yes, ma'am.
As someone who lost 2 friends that evening, I would personally really love to see everything come out, if possible. Do you think, whatever it is, do you think that your book will help that to happen? What is your feeling? Do you think there will be some kind of follow-up now?
I don't know. There's, as you can imagine, there's a lot of material in the Gordon collection in terms of material that probably could be published or brought to the light of day in some fashion. I'm really don't know how much farther to go than that. I think it's time 40 years later. I think, although this is an open wound in Kansas City, I think we still need to address that topic. There were a lot of people at the time who felt like they didn't get the whole story at the time. Well, this is maybe a bit more of that story, and there's a lot more of this story that could be told, and a lot more history about the Hyatt collapse that needs to be preserved in places like the Missouri Valley Special Collections. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for the book and the talk, and we're looking forward to reading it. And I missed an important point in your description about how the case got settled with some New York lawyer, but Bob was representing plaintiffs. Did he agree to the settlement?
He was forced to agree to the settlement. There was a team of lawyers who represented the plaintiffs in the federal class action lawsuit. The lead of that group was Irving Younger. Bob Gordon was a co-lead counsel in that team, but there were a couple more lawyers as well. They basically, outvoted him, froze him out from that decision. He did not want to agree to a settlement that he had no power to stop it.
Because he was not federally licensed to.
No, it was because of the team. The greater number of lawyers agreed to the settlement opposed to him.
With the greater number of plaintiffs, I take it.
Of the lawyers who represented the plaintiffs.
The most plaintiffs. I'm still not clear. So those lawyers outnumbered him with plaintiffs?
No, they just literally outnumbered him.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
As a result of the Kemper, and I wasn't aware of the Hyatt, or the other hotel, but because of the Hyatt, the Skywalk, has there been an accelerated study of the mechanics of the engineering of buildings this tall and the structure of them?
I would say one of the few things that came out of this whole affair was the fact that I believe the Hyatt is studied today by structural engineering students. It's a part of the course for so many of these classes across the country. I knew KU used it as part of their curriculum at some point. So the structural engineers really sort of took ownership in some respects to this situation. They saw that this was a failure of structural engineering, and they grabbed onto it. Bob Gordon's spread the blame a lot farther than that. He blamed the other entities involved with the project team, and the architects, the fabricators, the installers, the project managers. He thought they all should share in the blame rather than just two structural engineers who made an egregious mistake that led to that failed support system of the Skywalks.
Could I speak to that matter on a first-hand basis?
Sure.
I was part of a team that was involved in the reconstruction of the hotel. And prior to reopening, the mayor and Don Hall established a Blue Ribbon Committee to investigate every component of the hotel. And they hired yet another set of nationally renowned engineers to, in essence, if you're familiar with building, to do a punch list, to do a code-compliant punch list on every component of the building. And that punch list was put together, contractors were hired, and any deficiency that was noted in the punch list was corrected prior to the hotel being reopening. And I'll give you one example. In the hallways of the hotel, the sprinkler heads were required to be 72 inches above finished floor. And if there's a sprinkler head that was a 1/4 inch less or a 1/4 inch more, those were corrected. That's a level of detail in the fine-tooth comb that was went through to reopen the hotel. So I'll promise you, based upon my work 40 years ago, that it now is a safe building.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and attention.
Number one, you stated that there was never a letter cautioning the way that the skywalks were constructed.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
I think you said that there was never a inquiry about the construction of the skywalk.
I'm not sure I said that or follow you. I'm sorry.
Well, okay, because there was one, but it didn't involve the rods that held the skywalk. It involved the steel connections at each end, and when they made the connections at those ends, the concrete started spalling. And there was a letter written by me saying that I wouldn't allow, I was a mechanical project manager. And I said I wouldn't allow my pipe fitters or plumbers or any of my subcontractors. And I can't remember if sprinklers back then were mechanical, or subcontractors were mechanical, or they were, at some point back many years, the sprinklers were transferred from subcontractors to the mechanical contractors to subcontractors to the general contractors. We just had a sprinkler fitter here that made a statement about that.
Could you say your name, sir?
Bill McCarthy. Okay. And I was a mechanical project manager on the site.
Thank you.
And after they cleaned up the mess, they brought in engineers from all over the United States. And these guys went through all of the plans. They went through all of the codes, not just structural steel. And this obviously was a structural steel problem. But they went through all of them. And I spent months down there, where I was spending 50 or 75% of my days, because this engineer came in from San Francisco and he didn't like the way the waistlines were hung or supported or something. And this went on until they created probably the safest building in the United States now.
I am very sorry to interrupt, but we're running short on time, and we do have one more question that we need to get to over here.
I'm sorry, I can't hear very well.
Well, thank you, and you should write your memoir as well.
Thanks for coming. And you mentioned the settlement, and I was wondering if you can speak about Joe Teasdale and what he did for a lot of the people, especially the Catholics. He was ex-governor of Missouri.
Yeah. I can't comment on that because Joe Teasdale does not figure in my book, so I'm sorry. You probably know more about his role than I do.
Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. We have a few copies of the book still available. Thank you, Eli, for everything.
Yep, thank you.